Alrighty, welcome everyone. I'm going to get started into the webinar. You will get a video recording of this webinar into your email tomorrow. So if you do miss anything, don't worry, you will get a recording of the webinar. But welcome, welcome, welcome. I want to first start off by saying if you are not connected on our social media channels, please do that as soon as possible. That's where you're going to get all the updated information and not anything that RMDS Lab is doing in the future. So make sure you connect WeChat, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, and we would love to see you there as well. All right, so don't forget to ask all your questions and leave them in the chat box. Dr. Andrew Schroeder will answer those at the end, so please, please, please put them in the chat box. All right, so without further ado, I'm very excited to be your host for this evening. My name is Christy Fisher. I'm a part of the business development and sales team here at RMDS Lab. We are so excited to have you all here to enjoy Dr. Andrew Schroeder's Women Displaced, using disaggregated mobility data to study disasters. RMDS Lab is a data science company that specializes in helping researchers and data scientists worldwide to excel in a new era of big data and cognitive computing. If you're not already a member, we want you to join our ecosystem today. RMDS Lab was founded in 2009 by IBM Chief Data Scientist Alex Liu, and we are headquartered in Pasadena, California, with partners worldwide. We serve more than 40,000 members around the world. Without further ado, we are so excited to have Dr. Andrew Schroeder here with us again. Dr. Schroeder is the Vice President of Research and Analysis for Direct Relief. He leads Direct Relief's work in GIS mapping and humanitarian informatics. His work has been published and featured in various publications, including Science, The Lancet, The New York Times, Washington Post, Fast Company, Wired, and the New Humanitarian, Pre-Hospital and Disaster Medicine, and the International Journal of Cancer. Dr. Schroeder, along with his colleagues at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, is the co-founder of Crisis Ready, a research and response platform dedicated to real-time analysis of large-scale data to improve disaster response. He is also the co-founder and board president of the global nonprofit WeRobotics.org, which builds local capacity in robotics applications for the humanitarian aid, development, and global health in 30 countries around the world. Dr. Andrew Schroeder, thank you again so much for this, and take it away.
All right, thanks so much. Let me share my screen. Oops. And yeah, thanks again. This is a bit of a follow-up actually to a couple of webinars that I was able to do last year during the pandemic, during that phase of the pandemic, after I had a chance to meet Alex, and talked a little bit about kind of the overview of large-scale digital mobility data and what it has to do with disasters. At that time, we were particularly looking at the pandemic, at questions around social distancing and how to be able to understand the place of large-scale digital mobility data in epidemiological models. But I spent most of my time actually responding to disasters, and I thought that this would be a useful way to kind of go a little further into some of the data resources that are available to look at real-time understanding of what happens to people during disasters. How are they displaced? Where do they go? And in particular, some of the issues that have cropped up now around disaggregation by gender, which is, I think, one of the most interesting questions in the field right now. So let me get started. This is going to specifically focus on data from Facebook, and I'll go into some reasonable detail about that data as we go forward. Just to set the scene a little bit, internal displacement is, particularly after disasters and conflict, is just an enormous problem around the world. This is data from a study in 2018 by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, but you can see that as a result of a combination of conflicts and natural disasters. There are millions of people that are internally displaced around the world. And this is disproportionately borne as a burden by women and girls. It's also a significant problem in the United States, where the rising costs of climate change, in particular flooding and wildfire events, has affected communities really throughout the entire country, not just coastal areas, not just California, but really throughout the entire country. And again, as you'll see, disproportionately affects women and girls. And a couple of reasons why we're interested in that. So I work for an organization called Direct Relief as my principal work, and Direct Relief is a humanitarian health response organization. So we're really interested in this question of who's affected, what are their needs, how are those needs different from one another based on different vulnerabilities across time and space, community, and who you are makes a big difference as to what happens to you in a disaster, how you behave, and what you actually need in order to respond. So some of the key risks for women in disasters, beginning with health, focus in around access to maternal health and safe delivery services. A certain portion of women who are affected by disasters will be affected at a time when they are pregnant, and they will still need access to maternal delivery services. And that is increasingly an issue as displacement drags out longer and longer. So many parts of the world and many areas affected by climate change are producing very long-term disasters, which then also extend into postnatal care and other child health services. So reproductive health care as well, mental health, other services, long-term impacts affect differential access to healthcare. Risks of sexual and gender-based violence are extremely elevated, particularly in many of the poorer parts of the world, where human trafficking is a significant issue for people that have been displaced, who are highly vulnerable, who may have lost everything, and who are exposed to greater risks based upon on their new circumstances. They may have reduced financial resources, lack of adaptive capacity post-disaster, and then women still in most parts of the world play a disproportionate role in caring for families. And so the role that women play post-disaster also extends out to, in most cases, the disproportionate burden on their family. And so for all of these reasons, this is a really kind of central problem for us to think through. I was introduced to a lot of this data I'll go through with you around gender disaggregated displacement through a project at Facebook called Project 17, which is Facebook's effort to address the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and they've really foregrounded gender as one of their key concerns, and took a look at a number of different projects. Direct Relief's work was one of them, to see what kind of difference you could understand about different kinds of circumstances around aid and development through disaggregating data based upon gender. So, is there any difference at all when we kind of look at data around disaster displacement, and how does that impact what we might think about as changing our programming and our focus areas? So the key questions that I'm looking at here are fairly straightforward, actually. Do women and men tend to evacuate and return from disasters at different rates? Does the geography and the type of the disaster make any difference here to the gendered variance in evacuation and return? So, not every place is going to be affected equally, and there may be differences based upon wealth, and there may be differences based upon location, and the type of disaster actually may make a difference. The difference that relative wealth then in particular makes. So taking a look at, whether there are disproportionate burdens borne by poorer women in post-disaster situations, which really gets at some of those questions I was looking at earlier, which is about access to financial resources, access to healthcare, and kind of the disproportionate burden borne by, in particular, in low-resource environments by women. So the data sources in this case that we'll take a look at are through the post-disaster displacement data, which is disaggregated by gender, and that's from Facebook. And that's looking at, in this case, movement for long-term disaster displacement, not just sort of the real-time movement that we looked at last year. The relative wealth index, which is Facebook's effort to take a combination of remote sensing, survey data, and a couple of other sources, including the power grid in various parts of the world, and look at very fine-grained differences between wealth and poverty rates. Which is now available as an open data source on Humanitarian Data Exchange. And then a couple of different features which allow us to understand some of the disaster impacts from NOAA, and then from Esri, which has recently launched a new wildfire perimeter data source on ArcGIS Online. So just a little bit of background in this displacement data, which comes from Facebook. So this, again, comes from aggregated, anonymized information that is recorded from the movement of individuals that are using the Facebook app with location services enabled. And the reason why Facebook can do this is because they have an extraordinarily large user base that is spread over a large portion of the world, although not uniformly. And so we can use this through a set of data sharing agreements that researchers and nonprofit organizations can access with the Data for Good program to really understand, dynamics in real time about kind of humanitarian situations that we actually otherwise would have a pretty hard time understanding. So when we talk about someone who's displaced based upon their definition in Facebook, that means that we're looking at a 2-week window after a disaster, and there's an initiation point to the disaster that's determined either based on the role of safety check, which is their tool for determining whether or not someone is safe in a disaster. It's asked on the platform, or where it's initiated for some other reason. So there's a 2-week period where there's then a set of measurements that are done on the population that is moving around in the bounding box that's defined for that area. And that estimate is then compared to previous to the disaster, and a set of calculations are made for the both the imputed home location. So what's your most commonly visited location at night, both before and after disaster, and then the mean squared displacement. So basically the distance that you are displaced from that location at any given time, and where you're spending that time at night. So like where you're sleeping. And that means that you can then look at least 3 categories, although there's a fourth category of displaced abroad. But if someone's displaced, it means that their post-crisis location is 2 kilometers away from pre-crisis, plus they have to have their a longer distance. So in this case, double the usual value of the mean squared displacement for more than half of the time period that it's being evaluated in the post-crisis assessment. So basically, you're imputing a new location and then determining the distance from pre-crisis, and then saying that they're connecting frequently enough that they can be measured, and that's a certain distance beyond 2 kilometers during that post-crisis time period. And then that's evaluated on a regular basis. They're never displaced if that's not true, or if the post-crisis movement is less than double pre-crisis. So they're basically coming back home to their during that time period. So that would mean they have not actually been displaced, meaning they can actually come home. And then a certain number of users will simply not be able to be found. So they'll be unknown, they can't connect. So if that's true, fewer than 3 days post-crisis, then they're listed as unknown. So we know that they're in the data set. And in fact, actually, you can know their gender, which then becomes also important for understanding the baseline. So how many men, how many women are in that data set? You can use the unknown category to also calculate kind of the total population plus displaced plus never displaced. But we can't actually say anything about a certain portion that we don't know anything about. So if you take a look at how this would play out hypothetically, and this is all sourced from the Data for Good site. A never displaced person is someone where basically their home locations match, where their pre-post would look something like this, where they might venture out beyond it in the pre or post crisis situation, but by and large it matches. Someone who's never displaced here means that they actually are consistent with baseline movement, so they have an equal tendency to be away and home, and therefore even though a fairly reasonable portion of their movement is away, they actually are coming back home as well. That's not different from how they moved before, which is also an important kind of consideration around trying to filter out what might be called confounding movement here. So people move around for all kinds of reasons. You don't want to conflate just normal traffic, normal commuting with something that would equal displacement. So trying to compare those pre-post patterns becomes essential. And then someone who's displaced, you can see a much more distinct, just a much more large-scale distinction between where they're spending home and away. This is then measured on a daily basis, and a couple of the kind of markers for what would count as changing their status, basically. So what we're doing here is monitoring on a regular basis and seeing, did you change your displacement pattern during the time period post disaster where we're actually monitoring this. And so, for someone who's unknown, if they've been seen 3 days in a row, they're then transformed into never displaced or displaced. So they can become displaced during that time period. A displaced person is counted as return if they're observed 3 days in a row less than 2 kilometers away. So then you can say that their pattern changed and then they will be moved into the returned category. This is absolutely essential for being able to understand how long certain populations are forced to be away from their home after a disaster, which would go back to all those questions I started with about the reasons that people are highly at risk during a post-disaster situation. And then, if you're never displaced, it means that they're actually not checking the movement pattern. They're going to associate that with something that would otherwise be equal to a pre-disaster movement pattern. This is aggregated. It's not aggregated at the lowest possible level. They sum this up to cities, and that is both for the sake of maximizing the sample size. It also is a privacy issue. So you're making sure that even though the underlying data here is being calculated off of a fairly granular view of the user mobility and the kind of underlying demographics of the profile, then but this is summed into sort of these very large units at the city level. So that's them allowing us to look at trends in post-disaster situations without being at risk of revealing privacy or community vulnerabilities. And just, here's a basic timeline again. So, the baseline is being set 34 days prior to crisis. You're looking at then 2 weeks after crisis, and you're going to be looking at the variance across this whole time window during this time period. Um, so when we looked at this, and I looked at this principally in the United States for the work that we'll talk about in a second, some of the key findings here were that women do not evacuate and return from all disasters at higher rates than men. Some of them, the difference is really profound, actually, and some of them it's not. And there's interesting reasons for that, or hypotheses for that. Based on some of the events that in 2020, hurricanes seem to be much more likely to produce a disproportionate gender distinction than wildfires. That's interesting in terms of the way in which people evacuate from wildfires. If you had lower relative wealth, that also significantly impacted your likelihood to be displaced, especially where you were lower relative wealth was coinciding with a hurricane event. So flooding plus lower relative wealth, larger gender distinction. And then men were significantly more likely to be displaced farther away and to be displaced abroad in all situations. This has been universally true that men are more likely to spend more time farther away post-disaster, and they're also more likely to leave the country post-disaster, which relates often to just differences in financial well-being and access to resources. So if we take a look at the Gulf Coast, last year was a very busy year along the Gulf Coast. We had 4 major storms combined for an estimated $26 billion in damage. This led off with Hurricane Laura, and then went on. This was in late August, and then there was a back-to-back-to-back series of storms that included Sally, Delta, and Zeta across the course of the next couple of months. Many people actually to this day are still, suffering significant consequences from those storms. It takes a very long time to fully recover. So in many ways, this is still a very present kind of situation. And if we look at the regional displacement pattern from Laura, we see actually some quite interesting things. So the epicenter of this storm was a city called Lake Charles, Louisiana, which is it's a little bit inland from the coast, but it's along the Louisiana-Texas border. And you can see that, first of all, there was an extremely wide-ranging displacement pattern from the event. So, in terms of looking at this 2-week post-disaster window, people fled Lake Charles as far away in significant numbers as New Orleans, Houston, Dallas, and all the way down to Brownsville along the border with Mexico. The most prominent routes were into Lafayette, into Houston, and over to Baton Rouge. But really, it's a regional phenomenon, and this, in many ways, has to do with the scale of the impact of this storm. Over 8,000 houses destroyed. So, there was a large number of people that were having to flee fairly far away. We can look here at just the raw sum of people. The number of women significantly exceeds the number of men, although it starts out relatively lower. This is looking at returnees, and this is looking at displaced persons. There's a gap of about 2,000 people that narrows down here in terms of the raw numbers being calculated in this data set, out of the regional total of about 500,000 across, if you include everyone from Houston all the way to New Orleans, but in this area, measuring about 28,000 individuals from the onset of crisis. And this persists when you look at the normalized values, and then when you see the displaced abroad, it flips. So if you focus in exclusively on Calcasieu Parish, which is the area that was measuring the entire region, and now this is measuring just Calcasieu Parish, we see that the gap widens dramatically. So for Calcasieu Parish, the gap in rate of returnees and the distinction between displaced persons is much more pronounced than when we see that when we look across the entire region, including Calcasieu. The the distinction persists through the normalized values, although it's noisier, and the displaced abroad, although you're talking about very small numbers of people, nevertheless, it's still the same inverted curves. So, you know, if we take a look out at the entire area in terms of the who's in this population sample, roughly 56% of the total Facebook user base in the LoRa affected area is female, which is more than the underlying population value of about 52%, but the number of displaced persons, in particular in Calcasieu Parish, is 63% of everyone displaced, which is an enormous distinction from both the sample and the underlying population distribution. So you see that there's this huge gendered impact from the storm. And when we look at this displacement abroad again, we see that this is inverted in areas where men were more likely to leave the country post-disaster, which reflects back on some of these resource questions. When we look at this, overlaid, this is aggregated up on the relative wealth scale to look at county measures for relative wealth, that well over half of all of the areas that were most likely to be displaced were areas that were on the lowest end of the relative wealth spectrum. And so, this confluence between relative wealth, the type of disaster where flooding was causing both, immediate displacement, and it's very hard to come back to your home if there's extensive water damage and wind damage, made for very long-term kind of problems that were disproportionately borne by women. If we look at the wildfires in California, though, it's a little bit of a different story. So, obviously last year, in addition to the storm season, in addition to the pandemic, it was also really a dramatic, record-breaking fire season in California. We can also take a look at these same kinds of dynamics. So when we take a look at the lightning storms that hit the Northern California area, these displacement issues are principally inverted. And so if you take the entire region, this is looking at the LNU lightning complex fire, which principally hit the area of Santa Cruz and San Jose, so around Silicon Valley. You have a much more, you're much more likely to see men displaced than women within the population sample here. There's actually you're more likely to also have men in the Facebook user base here, although it's essentially equal to the population overall. So it's 51%, 51% women in the Facebook sample here, which is essentially the population distribution for the country. So it's not the same issue as in the South. When you look at the normalization values, you see that men were more likely to be displaced, and that this took place over a longer period of time, and men were also still more likely to be displaced abroad, but women came back a little bit faster. I think one of the things that then has to be kind of immediately thought about here is the type of displacement that happens in a wildfire situation. Unless your house actually kind of burns down, people tend to be displaced for less time than normal, and so they come back faster, and they may actually be less likely to leave for an extended period of time during that 2-week window. So there's just a lower overall rate of displacement. This particular year, there was also anecdotal evidence that people were refusing to spend time in shelters, or to go into situations where they might have been crowded with people that were suffering from or potential infections from coronavirus. And so there may have been some differences in this particular year, which are worth following up on. But nevertheless, interesting that it's inverted when you look at California. if we sort of look at just a basic calculation on relative wealth, though, the Southern Bay Area, towards San Jose, tended to be much higher rates of displacement for men. As you go towards the Northern Bay, though, and into areas which, are in global terms actually quite well off, but are relatively worse off in terms of relative wealth than the Southern Bay Area, the similar patterns for women being more likely to be displaced resurfaced. So again, you have this reassertion of the value around the confluence of gender and income, or in this case, relative wealth. And so, if you then take a look exclusively at some of these movement patterns from just looking at the displacement pattern from the north, out of Sacramento, in this case, again, for the same fire, these are close to equal, but you do have more of an assertion of this gender distinction when you look at areas that are less relatively wealthy. And I think that's something to really keep an eye on. If you just really quickly to end on this, there's some interesting, I mentioned at the beginning, this is really a very pronounced problem globally, given the number of people that are displaced internally due to global disasters. So I wanted to just quickly look at one example from this year, which is a extensive flooding event that happened in the Cusco area in Peru in February and March of this year. When I first started looking at this event, and here the yellow represents women, and the purple represents men. I first started looking at this and thought that actually it was, again, one of these situations where, the curve was inverted, and that there might be, distinctions that were kind of unique to behavior patterns exclusively. But if you look a little closer into here, you also see interesting examples of relative gendered access to technology, where when we go out into, so these areas here are major cities. Cusco and Lima are the largest cities in the country, and in those cases, the pattern of gender displacement fits what we saw earlier for Hurricane Laura in the United States. If you go out into these areas from Carabaya, Manu, Calca, etc., these are all relatively rural areas, and in these more rural areas, you actually have no women showing up in the sample at all. And I think as I've talked to people at Facebook about this, the most likely explanation is about who actually owns the phones in rural areas, or where women in poorer areas, more rural areas of a place like in the interior of Peru are more likely to have phones that are just feature phones, so they don't actually have the Facebook app, whereas the men would be more likely to have a phone that has access to the Facebook application. So again, those are reflective of differences in resources and access to wealth, and reiterate a lot of the patterns that we were seeing earlier in terms of the difference that gender makes to the likelihood of being displaced. And I think this is part of a much larger look at regularly integrating gender distinctions into how we think about who is displaced, how long they're displaced, where they're displaced, how far away they'll go, where are they likely to need services, and then what kinds of services can we connect them to. There's an enormous amount of work to be done in order to, apply more different statistical methods to understanding some of these distinctions, to build these into models that we can actually run in real time during every disaster as it occurs, and really make sure that we pay very close attention to who is being affected by disasters. I put a couple links in here, my contact details, access to direct relief, and then a Esri story map of this information that I put together, with the exception of the Cusco example, to take a look at some of the analysis. And I would be happy to take any questions that folks have. Great.
All right, everyone. Oh, this is where we open up for questions. So please make sure you're asking all your questions in the chat box. Let's take a look here.
The first one was from Joel. And I thanks, Joel, for putting that in. Yeah, so the Facebook is actually now the largest single publisher of data on the United Nations Humanitarian Data Exchange, which is free and open data. So you can go to this link at data.humdata.org, and you can find Facebook as an organization, and at least some of the resources that I was talking about here are available for download and analysis on that site. So resources you can get through there include the Relative Wealth Index, which was just published this past week. There's data on social ties, on the likelihood of two different areas of the world being connected to each other on Facebook. There's the high resolution settlement mapping layers, which are 30-meter resolution population density grids for the entire world, and several other sources. The gender analysis, though, is not on there, so it's actually something that's only available to researchers and nonprofits that have a data agreement with Facebook. There's a question from Dylan Kilby. Hi, Dr. Schroeder. My background is in statistical and environmental epidemiology, so the process of identifying trends fascinates me. Can you talk about how you compare the raw locations and movement? Do you use any particular statistical tests? Is it an intuitive, subjective interpretation based on obvious movement patterns? And what are most useful for you to identify what's most useful for you to identify if people are displaced? So kind of taking the last one first, so I think, the question of, I think you mean what's most useful to identify in terms of patterns in the data that would reflect trends that would reveal their kind of humanitarian need. So, in this case, I think the amount of time that people are spending displaced is probably the key factor. The length of time away from home is reflective of the likelihood that you're going to have a greater crisis or be in greater need of humanitarian support. So looking at the variance in the types of durations that you would see for different communities would be, I think, the most sort of useful marker of the likelihood of need of assistance. In terms of, the statistical tests or other kind of analysis on this, I mean, I think in some ways here, the key is to be able to get a sense of representativeness. So being able to reference this against the underlying population. We've looked at some regression analysis that looks at the same trends we were looking at here for the likelihood that you would have changes in variance that are related to a set of the independent variables that we just went through. I think we don't use that operationally in terms of, we're not looking at regression analysis in operations, and we're trying to communicate, broad patterns for the likely direction of the population that are easy to communicate. Looking at some of these descriptive analysis, basically the population is easier to communicate in most of these situations. But I think there's a lot of room for engagement on kind of the range of analysis that one would do here. Yeah, I mean, I think there's much more to also consider in terms of the underlying structure of the population. So, we're looking at, just issues around wealth disparity here. There's a whole set of independent variables. I think, things like spatial regression analysis play a significant role here for looking at, underlying demographic patterns as compared to the movement signal here. There's questions around the impact of previous disasters. There's some issues around, one I think the challenging issues of looking at this past year was that you had a set of disasters that are stacked on top of one another. So trying to just articulate the signals between different disasters is a little bit difficult. So there's issues of trying to understand the overlapping crisis impacts, but also looking at, what the issues around race, housing stock, the likelihood of being hit by previous disasters makes to some of these other patterns, which is worth doing more. Possible measures or policies to reduce gender differences. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to think about here is, so I think about this from the standpoint of assistance. I think when I think about that as a policy question, looking at access to resources post-disaster is not just a uniform question, right? So we have everyone is sort of equally likely to be impacted by a disaster, but they don't all have the same effect. So looking at making sure that healthcare resources in areas where you have these kinds of distinctions are, directed towards the gender tilt that we see in the population that's being displaced seems like a pretty relevant question, rather than applying a kind of uniform resource model. When you look at where to how to build gender into disaster preparedness understanding, there's a lot that goes into communicating messages about what to do post-disaster, what to do, what are the kind of issues that people are likely to face. We should be building things like women's healthcare into disaster preparedness messaging, and making sure that we understand right away that that we're likely to see that we need to just make sure that that's kind of understood as a core issue for everything that we're thinking about as the consequences of disaster. I think building more equitable societies is probably the better policy response, in the sense that often what you'll see is that the outcome of disaster simply reflects the underlying structure of the society that existed at the time of disaster. So people fall back on the resources they have. They're subject to the emergencies that were afflicting them the day before the disaster, and so building this kind of understanding of gender distinctions into this discussion becomes a way of being mindful of that disasters occur inside a setting of inequality, and that is something that we can make part of disaster preparedness and kind of broader policy issues. I understand that Facebook Geo Insights COVID prevention map data shows mobility on the daily basis of a country's population. What difference do you find between this and specific disaster data sets? Displacement in the face of a disaster can also be observed with the COVID prevention map, or only through the specifics of disasters. Do you know if there are any other differences between the two types of data sets? I think this is a really good question. So there's several different mobility data sets that are produced, at different levels of resolution. The COVID mobility maps, which are, some of them are actually also available as open data on HDX. They're measuring the rate at which people are displaced or not displaced, but the likelihood that they're moving away from home during the day, or the likelihood that they're staying put during the day. The similarity is that you're using an imputed home location, and you're measuring the movement of an individual outside of the individual base tiles around their home area, but you're only looking at it on a day-over-day basis. So you're not looking at these longer-term patterns. So it would be very hard to actually measure a longer-term displacement and return measure, given those kinds of day-to-day movement patterns. That it's also based on a in the case of the COVID-based maps, they're based on a fixed baseline of February of 2020, or end of February 2020. And that's going to miss, I think, a number of some of the population dynamics that are specific to certain areas, in an immediate in an area where disaster is happening. There's even more granular data that you can access through Geo Insights that's aggregated on a grid, where you can see at 600-meter cell levels the likelihood of a population moving from one place to another, or this is simply, again, it's very similar to the staying put or mobility measures, but you're looking at that again in a much more tactical sense. So, in any given day, what proportion of the population is moving, where are they moving from and to? You can see evacuation patterns, but these longer term displacement and return issues, there's no imputed home value in those grid cell measures. So you can't tell for any given kind of person who's represented in the data what their home location is and how long they're spending away from it. So you wouldn't be able to measure this displacement question in the same way, even though you're totally right that you could see the movement and the evacuation that's associated with people being long-term displaced. So using them in concert with one another becomes actually pretty useful.
Are there any other questions? All right, it doesn't look like there's any other questions. Dr. Andrew Schroeder, do you have any other last-minute things that you would like to add?
No, just that this is work that's also been done. The methodology that Facebook uses for this was also formulated in consultation with the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, which is based in Geneva. They look at, I reference their work at the beginning. And it's, I think, one of the interesting things about this community that there has been actually quite a lot of this, even though Facebook is a large-scale commercial entity, the methodology is really being informed, I think, by kind of key members of the community. So there's been kind of quite a lot of learning going on. I think the more that happens, the more we can actually effectively inform, upstream how some of this work, how some of this data is produced, what it's for, where the opportunities and the gaps are. And so it's a good reason to get involved, I think, because we can see that there actually is room for influence in some of these areas, and I think the displacement data is actually a pretty good example of it. So thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to the RMDS Lab team. Always a pleasure to talk with you guys, and I hope it was helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Schroeder. It was a pleasure having you again. And a couple things before we close out the day. You can find Dr. Schroeder in our expert portal on grmds.org, and you will be receiving this recording of this webinar in your email tomorrow. So be on the lookout for that. And then also, if you're not a member, make sure you sign up today to become a member at grmds.org. We would love to have you as soon as possible. And if you are interested in speaking in a webinar in the future, please contact us in the expert portal on grmds.org. Again, thank you so much for everyone joining us today and joining us this evening. Thank you, Dr. Schroeder, for your time and your expertise. We really appreciate it. and we will hopefully hear from you